Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is going to be an exciting, interactive presentation today, so prepare yourselves. To let you know a little bit about me, my name's Dana Northart. I am a psychology intern at Counseling Services here. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I'm actually from Colorado. So I've had the unique experience of working in substance abuse counseling over the years. The first year I was working in substance abuse counseling, I was the year that Colorado legalized medicinal marijuana. So I got to experience firsthand what was going on to the culture and the people who used marijuana at that time when it became medically available. I again was working in substance abuse in the state of Colorado when Colorado legalized it, and I conducted a cultural ethnography to learn more about how the culture was changing as marijuana became legalized. So if you have any questions, feel free to participate. Raise your hand, shout it out, whatever feels good. Let me know what's on your mind, and hopefully we can get all your questions answered. So to start off with, I want to talk about how marijuana first came about to be used in different societies, just in general. So some places that we see it used throughout history across the world is as early as 2737 BC. It was used for medicinal purposes in China. Things that it was treated for were things like rheumatism, gout, malaria, and actually absent-mindedness. It was treated with marijuana, so that's kind of counter to what we'd perceive in our culture today. It was also used in India and Muslim cultures recreationally because the Quran banned alcohol use. So that was something else that we see come up in different cultures. So it was used in all these different cultures, either culturally or medicinally. And then we see in 1890 is when hemp started to become a major crop to use for clothing products. It's also been used to treat labor pain, so women when they're birthing a child to relieve some of the pain. Marijuana has been used for that. It's also been used for nausea. So with all these things that were going on recreationally, in 1970 is when it started to become a controlled substance in the United States, and that was the same year that heroin and LSD were also included in the Controlled Substances Act. And then 1982 is when we started to see the war on drugs. So I don't know how many of you were around in the 80s to see what that actually looked like, but I'm going to show you. So when we say the war on drugs in the 80s, what comes to my mind is Ronald Reagan. So he was the president during the time, and he had a campaign called War on Drugs. It was actually something that was headed by his wife, the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. She was a main participant within it, and they started releasing a lot of ads on TV, some anti-drug ads. So we're going to look at what some of those were. And I apologize if this is really loud. I don't know how loud it's going to be, so...
Okay, last time. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Okay, so super informative, right? You guys know all about marijuana and what it does to your brain and how to make good choices? Yeah? Fried egg. All right. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I lost control of my mouse here. We're going to skip this one. Okay, here's another one.
Getting into drugs and being high is a stupid thing to do. So being in control and saying no is not the easiest thing to do. Be unoriginal and take a stand to a free to say no. And let a friend push you in. Taking drugs, you got it right. You say no, no, right to say no.
So that was another big campaign slogan, is that you have the right to say no. Just say no. Kind of the anti-Nike ad So just do it. This is just say no. Believe it or not, that actually was not super tacky and ridiculous in the 80s. That was something that actually spoke to the youth of the time. But again, not super informative. Okay, so this was another one. And this one wasn't targeting kids. This was targeting parents. Oh. I got too many buttons here to figure out. There we go.
Are these your drugs?
Look, Dad, it's
Where
not
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
Okay, so again, very straightforward in what they're trying to communicate. Basically, what we're looking at here are ads that are trying to target your emotions. What's going to happen to you if you do drugs? Well, your brain's going to become a fried egg, and your children are going to use drugs, and you're not going to be cool, and you're not going to be accepted, right? None of that stuff actually gives you information about what this substance is. So what they tried to do to educate people more about substance use and marijuana use was they developed the DARE program. Anybody in here take DARE? Really? Only a couple people? Anything like it? I took something called Operation Aware. Scared the crap out of me. They told me all these things about drugs that gave me nightmares. I remember having nightmares about what I thought drugs were going to do to me. And so over the years, the efficacy of these different programs, DARE stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education. There's been a lot of research around these to try to see how effective they are, and there's been some really mixed results. It's been found that kids who go through these programs may not have any lower experience or exposure or decisions to use drugs. And in some instances, it introduces kids to the idea of drugs. And so some of the kids who participated in DARE actually had higher levels of drug use. So it's kind of been mixed across the board. And again, this can be a cultural thing based on where these programs were targeted and implemented. So this is kind of our first glance of what do we do to try to help people understand more about substance use. So flashing forward to modern use and try to get a better idea of different things that are actually out there as far as how to use marijuana these days. The first thing to be aware of is the potency within marijuana has gone up a ton since your parents were in college. So some research has indicated that it could be twice as strong or up to 7 times as strong in THC levels than what marijuana had in the 70s. There's also different ways of using marijuana these days. So looking at the content of THC, which is the psychoactive element within marijuana, flower is what is often referred to as bud. It's what a lot of people smoke if it's smoked in a pipe or a joint. It's in that lower right-hand corner. It's a little bud. It's called flower. It can be anywhere between 1 and 20% THC levels. So that's a pretty wide range. You may not know exactly what you're getting just because you get a certain flower. Oil and wax have a higher THC level. And so looking at oils or waxes, those are commonly used in what's called a rig. So rigs are different than traditional pipes or joints or things like that, and they tend to be used by a single person. They're not always passed around in social groups like pipes would be. But that's in the picture. That's like a close-up in the picture in the upper right hand. Then next to that we have hashish. Hashish can range in potency between 120% THC levels. And then again, we have edibles. So looking at edibles, this is something that when marijuana became legal in Colorado, became a huge issue because initially they didn't indicate how much THC was in the edible that you were taking. And typically, a dose that you would want to take, that would be what most people are looking for in their experience, is that you would want to take 1/10 of a candy bar. Well, the problem with that is you take a tenth of a candy bar and you sit around for a half hour and you don't feel it yet. So you just go ahead and eat the whole candy bar. Well, that can present a problem. So these are new things that are starting to be introduced into our culture as marijuana becomes legalized. Colorado is starting to institute other laws that the edibles have to be labeled with the potency level. And also another problem, if you look at the picture of the edibles in here, is they look like candy. They just look like regular candy. And if you're a little kid who doesn't know how to read, you don't know that that's not candy. So again, this is another issue that's coming up within our culture. So just looking at what we've come to know so far in the first year and a half of legalized marijuana, the first month of legalized retail marijuana was 14 million. That may have been up until the date that this study came out. That might be a little bit high. Prices for marijuana can be up to $20 a gram. They can even be higher than $20 a gram retail in Colorado. If you don't know how much a gram is, it's about the size of maybe a couple of nickels. So it's not a ton. So looking at the differences between how much marijuana costs retail versus medical versus street, there's a little graphic there. I hope you all can read it because there is a pretty big difference. But something that has been found in studies of seeing what's happening with legalized marijuana is that there's no change in the black market. Sales in the black market haven't gone down. And what that means is that the people who are using marijuana legally are new users. Or the people who are using off the black market are using a lot more to compensate. And so what we can see from some of these numbers is that there's a lot of marijuana being sold legally, and there's still a lot of marijuana being sold illegally. So some of the laws around that, if you do choose to venture over to Colorado, since it is our neighboring state, is you can't consume it in public. You can't be under the influence when you're driving, and you have to be 21 or older to consume it. So it's a lot like alcohol in that there are certain restrictions around it. So some people get the idea of like, oh, I have it and it's legal and I can use it wherever, and that's not true. Another issue that the legalized marijuana market is facing is that marijuana is still a federal crime. Selling it and distributing it and using it is still a federal crime. So the banks can't get funded. They can't get federal funding because most banks are federally insured. So because of that, they have to deal in cash only. So that's kind of sketchy, right? Like you're trying to open a new business and you have to deal in cash. So everybody knows that you have a load of drugs in the back, and in the front you have a load of money just held up in the safe. So the way that things are moving in the legal direction still haven't been figured out. And more consequences of heavy use are coming to light as it's becoming more culturally acceptable. Okay, so now we're going to go through a list of what's potentially a fact, what's potentially a fiction. So these are common questions that are common comments I've heard from people who use marijuana, about marijuana. So I think a big one is some people drive better when they're high. We say that's fact or fiction? That's fiction. Okay, there are no documented overdoses of marijuana use. Is that fact or fiction? That one's a fact. There are no documented overdoses. Smoking marijuana while drinking can balance you out. Fact or fiction? That one's fiction. Marijuana is safe because it's a natural plant. Fact or fiction? We're going to go with fiction. And we're going to break these down to explore these questions more. Okay, so the next one are there are documented medicinal benefits of marijuana. Fact, fiction? That one's a fact. Marijuana can help treat people with ADHD. Fact or fiction? That one's fiction. You cannot become addicted to marijuana. Fact or fiction? Fiction. Marijuana is safer than alcohol. That one's fiction. And we will talk about these, okay? Okay, first one that we have is some people are better drivers when they use marijuana. Okay, so there's actually been ways that people have tried to study this, like legitimately look into it. Some people report they feel like they're better drivers when they're smoking marijuana. So is that actually true? Well, slower driving and paranoid driving don't necessarily indicate safer driving. There's been statistics, fatal car accidents in which at least one person was high on marijuana has tripled in the past 10 years. In 1992, at-fault drivers in car accidents, there was a 4.2% rate of people who were intoxicated on marijuana. And in 2010, that's jumped to 12.2%. So as we're seeing more social and cultural acceptance of marijuana use, we're also seeing it being impacted in driving accidents. Another study found that 1 out of 9 drivers in fatal car accidents were high on marijuana. And looking at what marijuana actually does to your brain and how it can specifically impair you in your ability to drive is that it affects your perception of time, reduces your spatial ability, and impairs coordination. So if you do have to react to something quickly, your brain doesn't communicate that to your body as quickly. Any questions or comments so far? Don't want to blow through this too fast. Okay. All right. Smoking marijuana while drinking can balance you out. So this one I think is especially dangerous. It's basically what you're saying is the more substances you put into your body, the healthier you are. Which really doesn't pan out when you think about it in other terms. We don't talk about using, a painkiller and an antidepressant, and you're balanced out that way. These drugs have different effects on your body, and so they're going to affect you differently. So alcohol can cause your body to absorb THC more quickly. So this means that it's increasing the intoxication level. Some people have come up with the term of greening out. Have you all heard of this term before? I've never heard of this. Okay, I'm glad it's not just me. But it's feeling sweaty, dizzy, nauseous, and can lead to vomiting. So the problem that comes up with this is that when you start to drink alcohol, when you're just drinking too much alcohol and you start to experience alcohol poisoning, your body generally starts to vomit. And this is a way to get the alcohol out of your body to make sure that you're not poisoned and that you don't die. Well, when you introduce marijuana to your system, marijuana, one of the things that it does is it's an anti-nausea. It has an anti-nausea effect. So when the alcohol is telling your brain, you need to throw up, you have too much alcohol inside your body, the marijuana tells your brain, no, it's okay. And so when normally your body would be trying to get this alcohol out, you can actually increase the likelihood of getting alcohol poisoning. When we actually look at what alcohol versus marijuana do to your system, alcohol is a depressant and it slows down your nervous system. Marijuana also slows your body down. So nothing about this is balancing out. Using them concurrently will magnify the effects of both, and it's really unpredictable of how different people are going to experience that. So it's kind of adding more of a question into the idea of what's going to happen when I put these substances into my body. Okay, marijuana is safe because it's a natural plant. I always thought this was interesting. It's such a simple argument, but I don't know how much stock we can put into it. So does anybody know what this first plant is on the left? That's marijuana, yes. Okay, so we've been talking about marijuana. Does anybody know what this middle plant is? That one's tobacco. So I always wonder when people argue that marijuana is safe because it's natural, why I don't hear the same argument for tobacco. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody argue that. And I wonder what that would actually look like if that was an argument that we tried to have. Does anybody know what the last plant is? Poison ivy. You all knew that one. Do you know what happens when you smoke poison ivy? You can die. You get a rash on the inside of your lungs. Yeah, not pretty. It's a natural plant. I mean, you run into it pretty often when you're camping, right? So just because something's natural doesn't mean that it's safe for you. There's tons of plants that grow in nature that are poisonous. Okay. So marijuana can help treat people with ADHD. So we have some symptoms here. Lack of concentration, lack of coordination, short-term memory loss, random thoughts or actions. What are these symptoms of? You can shout it out, it's okay. ADHD? Okay, any other guesses? Marijuana. It's both. It's both, everyone. So when you're trying to treat these symptoms with a substance that actually induces these symptoms, it's not going to be helpful for you. So the reason that people can perceive that marijuana is helping them with their ADHD symptoms is that marijuana increases level of dopamine, which is something Ritalin does as well, which is a medication prescribed for ADHD. But basically what dopamine does is it makes us feel happy, it makes us feel good. So it's not necessarily indicating that your ADHD symptoms are improving, it's indicating that you feel better about the fact that you have those ADHD symptoms. Something else is what happens with people with higher compulsivity within ADHD and how that can affect substance dependency with marijuana. So that's something we'll go into next. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, you cannot become addicted to marijuana. So first of all, the question is, what is addiction? And this is kind of a loaded question. It's something that's debated within the medical field and the mental health field. How do you define what addiction is? Because it's different for different people. The way that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders describes it, which is the Diagnostic Handbook for Mental Health Professionals, is if you have 2 of the following symptoms within a 12-month span. So that's 2 symptoms a whole year, okay? There's a lot, okay. Requiring larger amounts over a longer period of time than intended. Persistent desire or recurrent inability to cut down or quit. A great deal of time is taken obtaining or using the substance. The presence of cravings. Failure to fulfill responsibilities at home, work, or school due to marijuana use. Continued use of marijuana despite having problems at home, work, or school. Decreasing important social, occupational, or recreational activities due to marijuana use. Use when it becomes physically dangerous to you, and then continuing to use despite physical problems. Tolerance or withdrawal. So tolerance is when you need to take more to get the desired effect, and withdrawal are symptoms that you experience when you're not using the substance. So if you experience 2 of those over a 12-month period, it may indicate that you have a substance dependency, or at least a substance misuse problem. So these are different things to consider when trying to understand what addiction is that there's a bunch of different ways that these different symptoms can come across in some people. It's possible to have an addiction without having withdrawal symptoms. It's possible to have an addiction without your tolerance going up. A lot of people think these are necessary to indicate some sort of addiction, and that's not true. Again, there is no documented overdose of marijuana. It's not something that's come up. But here's a list of withdrawal symptoms that have been reported by marijuana users. So this information was taken from Marijuana Anonymous. I think a lot of times people feel like there aren't any withdrawal symptoms from marijuana because they're expecting their withdrawal symptoms to be similar to what we see in withdrawal symptoms from alcohol. But they are very different. So These are some personal experiences that people have shared on the Marijuana Anonymous website. When I was working in Colorado, I was speaking with a substance abuse counselor in an inpatient facility, and he has started to see more severe withdrawal symptoms, and he said the most severe that he had seen was he had a person come in who was vomiting blood due to their high use of marijuana because the person's lungs were bleeding. And now that they weren't using it anymore, some of those symptoms were coming back up. So there are some things that have yet to be discovered because based on a lot of the levels of THC in the marijuana people have used up until this point is different than what we're seeing more recently. So I think this is the trickiest question. Is marijuana better for you than alcohol? So I think whenever we talk about the dangers of a substance, it's always relative, right? And I think when there was debates going on in legalizing marijuana in Colorado, this was one of the big questions, is that, well, yeah, we have a high problem with alcohol misuse in the state of Colorado. Denver had the highest drinking and driving incidents per capita than any other city for quite a while. Alcohol misuse is a big problem in that state. So it makes sense why people would look to marijuana as maybe a happy alternative. But looking at what that actually means, how do people use marijuana versus how do people use alcohol? I've never heard of anybody using marijuana to complement the taste of their steak. Okay, people can have a glass of wine, they can have a beer, they can use alcohol without abusing it. They can have a drink without getting drunk. Typically when people use marijuana, they use it to get high. The purpose is to become intoxicated. So again, looking at how is that used, that's relative in that sense. Another big issue that was looked at is the effects of alcohol and marijuana. Alcohol doesn't stay in your system nearly as long as marijuana does. It'll usually be out, depending on how much you drink, it could be out within a couple hours or the next day. It can be detected up to, I think there are certain tests that can detect alcohol use up to like 96 hours, but that's the longest. So marijuana, on the other hand, is fat soluble. So people in general have fat all over their bodies, but our fattest organ is our brain. So when you use marijuana, that substance is going to stay in your brain. It's not just going to stay in your body, but it's going to stay in your brain. So when we talk about driving while intoxicated on marijuana, what does that mean? Like, how recently did you have to use this substance to still be intoxicated? Especially since some of the effects of marijuana are less subtle than the effects of alcohol. There's been studies that regular marijuana use beginning in adolescence has been shown to decrease IQ points by an average of 8 points. It also increases the rate of the loss of neurons in the hippocampus, which is where the hippocampus is highly associated with memory. And so you start having memory loss at an earlier age. And it can also impact your ability to form new memories. And then again, the most common way to use marijuana is smoking it. So smoking anything is never good for you. It's never healthy for you. There have been studies suggesting drinking a glass of red wine is helpful for your heart. So there have been some studies that indicate some alcohol use as actually being healthy. And the studies from how marijuana use is healthy, there's been medicinal indications, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy for you. Just as much as taking a painkiller may be helpful for you, but it doesn't mean that it's good for you. Okay, so physical and emotional consequences of marijuana use. So one of the biggest ones, like we've been saying, smoking can produce respiratory problems.
People who smoke marijuana frequently but do not smoke tobacco have more health problems and miss more days of work than those who don't smoke marijuana. And again, that's back to respiratory illnesses. It's been estimated that marijuana users have a 4.8-fold increase, so that's almost a 5 times over increase of heart risk, and may have a higher risk for a heart attack within the first hour of smoking. So these are some of the physical symptoms or physical consequences of using marijuana. Some of the emotional stuff, on the other side of things, marijuana may be associated with depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts among adolescents, and personality disturbances, including a lack of motivation to engage in typically rewarding activities. So if you've been around people who use marijuana fairly regularly, they may not want to engage in a lot of activities that don't involve using marijuana. So it's difficult to find pleasure in things that you normally find enjoyable. If they're not using marijuana, it's not enjoyable anymore. Something else that they have found in a lot of studies of it, which is one of the arguments for legalizing marijuana, is so we can learn more about it and study it more, is that it can produce psychotic reactions. So what that means is hallucinations typically. So if you start seeing things or start hearing things that aren't there, feeling more paranoid, things like that. In some users, using marijuana can worsen the course of illness with patients with schizophrenia. So what they found is people who are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, so if they have a family history of schizophrenia, if they start using marijuana, it'll kind of trigger that, identify that marker, and trigger schizophrenia. That's rare. It's a rare thing. It's not common, but it is something that has been found to happen. So this is an interesting new place of exploration within the research that they're doing. It's called amotivational syndrome. And it was actually the product of a drug that a drug company in the UK was developing, and it kind of simulated the same neurological response that marijuana provides. So what it would do is it would stimulate these chemicals in your brain to be released. So they're called 2-AG and anandamide. That's not how you say it. I don't know how to say it. But what these do is when these chemicals are released in your brain, they attach to receptor sites. So it's the way that chemicals work in your brain is that you have two neurons next to each other, right? They're like this, and there's a gap in between them. And this one will spit out chemicals, and this one will pick them up. Okay? When the chemicals are in between, it's when you feel good. So when you have serotonin in between in this gap, it's when you start to feel happy. So what these are doing is this neuron would spit out the 2-AG and the anandamide, however you say it. And this one would pick it up. And so when this would happen, the marijuana user would get the desired effect. But what they found was when the receptors would start to pick up these chemicals, they would start disappearing. They wouldn't be there anymore. It's like they did their job, they're done, they're out. So what happened was people started feeling like they can't get pleasure anymore. It was, this drug was chemically stimulating or simulating what marijuana was like, but what it was actually doing was taking away all the pleasure centers in their brain. And they lost motivation. Nothing sounded good. Nothing sounded fun. So they stopped selling the drug. They stopped making it because it was just kind of killing people's brains off. But what they found was there's a similar effect with people who use marijuana more regularly. And also what they found is most people don't develop this syndrome. So again, it's something to be aware of, but it's not necessarily going to happen if you use marijuana. So what I also want to touch on is marijuana laws in Kansas. So Kansas has some of the most strict marijuana use laws out of any other state in the country. So a first offense of any amount, so if you just have a bowl or a joint on you, it can be up to $2,500 a year in jail or both. The second offense is a felony. No matter how much it is, the second offense is a felony. Then as far as cultivation and distribution, depends on how many plants you have. So again, the minimum, well, the lowest level, I shouldn't say the minimum, but the maximum for the lowest level for your first offense is still $2,500 and up to a year in jail or both. So these are things to be aware of when, if somebody asks you if you want to try something or if you want to carry something or can you hold this in your car for me, that it's not something that's just going to be a slap on the wrist if you're caught. So just to be aware of, these are pretty serious consequences in the state of Kansas. It's also not legal to drive over to Colorado and then bring it back. Really don't do that. They don't like that, and you wouldn't be the first person to think of that. So yeah, keep that in mind. When it comes to K-State and the policy here, K-State follows the federal, state, and local law. So it's possible that you may not receive the maximum penalty, the first offense that you get, or things along those lines. But still, K-State takes drug use pretty seriously, and these are the guidelines for everybody who lives in the state. So something else to be aware of is that the K-State police are police officers. They're not security guards. They're actual legitimate police department. So if you do get caught with a substance, then they're going to enforce it just like anybody else would pull you over in different areas of the state. So what this all kind of comes down to is personal decisions. Keeping all this stuff in mind, a lot of the stuff I talked about today was worst case scenario. I'm going to acknowledge that. There are lots of people who have used marijuana and have not experienced a psychotic break or vomited blood or were unable to find pleasure in any other activities for the rest of their life. These are extreme things that we're looking at. But it does come down to personal decisions. And that's something else to consider when thinking about using marijuana. Because one of the things that marijuana does, like a lot of other substances, is that it changes your mood. And it dulls your senses, which means that your brain is no longer firing on all cylinders, so to speak. When you don't have that emotional part of your mind to help you make decisions, you may not make the best ones. So this Venn diagram we have up here is what's called a wise mind. And taking into account when you make your decisions that you're using the logic behind it, what might happen to me, and also the emotions behind it. What's actually motivating me to use this substance? Is it something that I want? Am I curious about it? I want to try this? Or is it more an emotion that somebody is pushing you into? And taking, regardless of what these different things are, taking them all into account to make a decision that's right for you. So I don't know if any of you remember this ad. I felt like this ad from a more recent anti-drug campaign, I felt like it was more accurate to what marijuana use can be like. And this isn't the Just Say No campaign anymore. It's the Live Above the Influence. So again, it kind of comes down to personal decisions.
So, Sarah, what's going on here? Sarah? Sarah?
She won't answer you. Or she can't.
Why not?
This is the way it's been since she started smoking pot. She's all lazy and boring and... You know, we used to have so much fun together.
And now?
This is what we do.
So I think it can also be helpful when you're talking about, or when you're thinking about different choices. What are you actually doing? Are you just sitting on the couch and laughing at stupid things? Is that really the decision that you'd like to make every night of your college career? Or is there something else that you can be doing? One way I like to think about it, and this is just like an aside, an editorial of my own personal experience, is if we were being watched by aliens and they were watching your behavior, if they were watching us drink, they'd watch us go out to these bars, put substances in our bodies until we threw up, and then go home, go to bed, and get up and do it again the next day. Kind of weird, right? Well, what does it look like when we smoke marijuana? Well, you just kind of sit around, and then you smoke more, and then you eat some stuff, and then you smoke more, and then maybe play video games or watch a movie that you've seen 10,000 times, and then you smoke more. So when you think about personal decisions and what's a good fit for you and what you actually want your college career to look like, these are also things to take into account. How does it affect your body? How does it affect your mood? And how does it affect your life overall? So that's all I had. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, well, if you didn't sign in, please sign in before you go. Otherwise, I appreciate everybody coming. It's nice chatting with you today.